Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Tasha Hubbard, a Cree award-winning filmmaker, writer, and assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Tasha is from Peepeekisis First Nation in Treaty 4 territory. Her documentaries, including nîpawistamâsowin, We Will Stand Up, have helped create national conversations about racism on the prairies. Tasha, thanks so much for being with us. A pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Some may have caught nîpawistamâsowin, We Will Stand Up last month on APTN or over the past 2 years. It tells the story in part of the death of Colten Boushie and the aftermath, but also the colonial history of the prairies and part of your own life. Why was this a film that you wanted to make?
You know, I've said a few times that this is actually a film that I didn't want to make, that I didn't want, that there are circumstances that this event even happened in the first place, because this could have happened very differently. You know, the Stanley family could have made very different choices, and, you know, this film wouldn't have had to have been made. I'll say I felt compelled to make it. I had just finished my first feature and had actually intended on just taking a bit of a break, but this, you know, when it happened, I was so struck by the suddenness of the violence, of the response by the RCMP, the actions of the RCMP, by the horrible social media comments, some made by leadership, by people who are in leadership positions. And I just thought, this story has to be followed. And, you know, I already knew Jade, and, you know, some of my family knew some of Colten's family, and so, you know, I spoke to them really early on and said, I don't know what this will end up being, but I feel really strongly that this should be documented, that what you're going to go through now, that someone should be following and tell that side of the story, and here we are.
As I mentioned, you tell part of your story in the film, include your family. Why was that important? You know, I had been asked to do that in my previous films by, you know, various story editors or producers, and, you know, I always said no, that you know, this, even though my positionality as, you know, as a Cree filmmaker, but also as someone who was adopted into a farm family and grew up in rural Saskatchewan, that you know, I bring that to my films. I bring that sort of, you know, wide perspective. But I think because, like so many others, I felt this, what happened to Colten, so deeply in my heart and, you know, in my gut. And I know I'm not alone. I've had many people tell me that's how they felt as well. And of course I thought about, you know, the children in my life. And when I heard the news, I actually had my son and my nephew in the car with me, and I kept looking at them in the rearview mirror. And, you know, they were 9 at the time. And I thought, what kind of world are they going to live in when they're in 10 years from now? You know, when they're adults, when they're out in the world. And if we're at a place where people we live amongst can celebrate the fact that a young Cree man was killed, you know, that's very worrying. And I just thought I need to contribute to this conversation. It's not even really a conversation, right? But I want it to be. I want it to be a conversation, and I just thought I can contribute to that in some way. You mentioned the police investigation of this case, the online reaction, and the racism that came out. Was that a surprise to you, or was this, you know, to be expected?
I've, in my past work, have grappled with abuse of power in policing and structural racism in policing. So that part, no. I think that this is a real problem. I think that, you know, the denials still keep coming from those in high up positions.
But as we know over the events of the last couple of years, this is a reality, and it's something that needs to be dealt with, in really strong ways. I was also not surprised about racism in the Prairies. I think that racism is across North America. I think there's a particularity about it in the Prairies. And I'll say this, as someone who's relatively fair-skinned, I grew up, in non-Indigenous communities, and I heard the range of racism that exists because people didn't automatically know that I was and felt safe saying the things that they think. And so that part I wasn't surprised about. I think I was surprised at how ugly it was, though, on social media, how willing people were to be open about it. And I think that has also, unfortunately, been the result of the last few years and the political place we're in North America in general. And I continue to, think about, is this really where we're at? And I want people to think about that. I want people whose relatives there are who are saying these things, to challenge that, to push back, because we're here together, and Indigenous people are not going anywhere. So let's figure this out.
Colten's death and the acquittal of Gerald Stanley really did become it was a national conversation. The family, Jade spoke at the United Nations, family met with the Prime Minister. How disappointed are you that nothing really has materialized out of those meetings?
I am disappointed. I think everyone is disappointed. One thing that isn't widely known is in February, just before COVID shut everything down, Jade, Debbie, a couple of supporters, and myself came back to Ottawa. We had a screening in Parliament for MPs and senators, and several meetings again with cabinet and the Prime Minister himself. And we mentioned, you said there was going to be real action taken. You made commitments to this family that this was the beginning, and that a conversation would continue where they would be able to be specific about where things went wrong. And it's things that were outlined in the film and more. I mean, a film can only tell so much. There's much, much more to this story. And we said, this hasn't happened. There was commitments made, and this hasn't happened. And the family is still calling for, there needs to be an inquiry into this case. There are elements that that happened that in terms of within the Crown Prosecutor's Office, in terms of within the RCMP, that if this isn't called out, if this isn't exposed, it's going to continue. And that hasn't sort of landed on that's landed on deaf ears. But I think that it speaks to the larger system and we're seeing the RCMP continue. I mean, how many deaths have happened for Indigenous people and people of color for wellness checks. Family members calling because they're worried about their loved one, and they come and kill them. There's a real problem. And as we remember, the head of the RCMP and the head of the Alberta Detachment deny that there's systemic racism, or say they don't know what it means, and that's not acceptable. That wasn't acceptable in 1873. It's not acceptable now. So yeah, I would say that I think we should all be disappointed that there hasn't been more done.
There's a scene in the movie where you take your family to the RCMP museum in Regina. It's an emotional moment for yourself. Can you talk about why you wanted to take your family there and why it was important to include in the film?
Well, I think that in mainstream education for many years, and in the sort of branding that time that we're in, where everybody has their brand and wants to, promote their brand, the RCMP are no different. I worry that the history of policing is going to get lost, that the way in which the RCMP were used to enforce the Indian Act, the arrests that were done in the dead of night of family, fathers who just want to feed their children, being taken away, our ceremonies, our ceremonial leaders being arrested and their ceremonial items being confiscated. The list goes on. I could go on for quite a while, but I'll just say that I worry that's not going to be talked about. And, I want, my son and my nephew to know this history and to be critical thinkers. And that's where we're heading. I see that in them. I see this generation coming that are already critical thinkers at such a young age. But it was really emotional for me to see that moment when Big Bear signed treaty, because he could see already that Canada wasn't honoring their commitment, early, and that's the thing. The leadership realized this isn't what we agreed to. And the discrepancy between the oral commitments and what was written down. I mean, and at the end of the day, I mean, Big Bear and his family and his people were the victims of Canada's starvation policies. Of John A. Macdonald, Dewdney, Duncan Campbell Scott, all of these men who knew exactly what they were doing, and that it was going to result in the deaths of families and children. That's our history. And, I want the boys to grow up knowing that and understanding that, they are here because people fought so hard to survive, because they loved their children and their grandchildren and all of their grandchildren to come. And so, yeah, I wanted to be able to talk to them about that.
Tasha, we're going to talk about some of your other films. We do just need to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with award-winning filmmaker Tasha Hubbard. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is award-winning filmmaker Tasha Hubbard. And Tasha, I'd like to talk about your 2004 documentary, Two Worlds Colliding, a look at Saskatchewan's infamous freezing deaths, also known to many as Starlight Tours. It looks at the story of Daryl Knight, who was dumped by police in a field on the outskirts of Saskatoon. Knight survives, but others have not. Why was this a story you wanted to tell?
The mainstream media has a lot to atone for, I think, historically and even into today, on how they report on Indigenous stories. And, at the first, that was it. I just thought, how is this story, how is it going to be told? And, I wanted to give space for the community, the families of these men, to have a space to speak. And it just went from there. We started filming with the NFB as the producer.
And while you're filming this, the inquest into the death of Neil Stonechild was ongoing. What was it like filming at this time in Saskatoon?
Saskatoon's not a big community, and that was one of the things I was really wanting to show, was just how this was affecting people, and relationships that people had, or lack of relationships that people had. Mm-hmm. And it was a tough time, and I think that we didn't, when we started, I didn't quite realize the story about Neil and what had happened. And then, when I started look into it, you know, again, I had people I knew who were friends with him, you know, and so, you know, it just, you know, you just start to uncover a little bit, and then you realize there's deeper stuff happening here. You know, I think I in one of the interviews I did after the film, someone pointed out to me that I had just moved to Saskatoon in 1990, and that I was the same age as Neil. And, you know, that really hit home, that this young man, you know, didn't have a chance, you know, didn't have a chance to figure out what he wanted to do with his life, didn't have a chance to meet somebody and have children and have a life. And
I got to watch it just last week, so there's a lot of things that stay with me, but we're running out of time. So one of those things that I do want to get to, though, is one of the investigators pointing out that it was going to take an entire generation of new police officers, you know, getting rid of an entire generation of police before anything would change. It's been more than a generation since the death of Neil Stonechild. And what do you make of that, and where we're at with policing today?
Well, my big concern, I always appreciated Oliver and his perspective on things, because he's seen it all, you know, as an Indigenous person on the inside, and, you know, knowing how entrenched these beliefs and attitudes are, and you know, are baked in to policing in Canada. You know, I guess my concern is the increased militarization of police, and, you know, seeing their budgets and the purchase of tanks and body armor and all of these things, you know, that haven't made a difference, you know, in there being, you know, safety in the community. It's actually made it the other way, where it's been unsafe for people because of, you know, this you know, and it's an attitude that comes with that militarization, right? So that's really concerning, and that's something I didn't see happening at the time, but I've seen in the years since. You know, I see the shift in, you know, when I spoke about branding, like police being very, very concerned with their public image, and, you know, not necessarily making the changes, but marketing that they have or that they are, and that's concerning, you know, when we have police forces across Canada, you know, fighting to hold on to their carding policies, you know, where they can stop anybody at whim. And it's often people of color, it's often Black people, it's often Indigenous people. And, you know, and having the power that they have, you know, most people, you know, will give in because of the fear, right? And of course you're going to fear a police officer that rolls up in a great big SUV, you know, comes out with his aggressive stance or her aggressive stance, wearing body armor and you know, escalating a situation that doesn't need to be. So, you know, I have a lot of concerns, and there's, you know, and there's a lot of pushback.
Sorry, Tasha, we do have to step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. To hear an extended version of this interview with Tasha Hubbard, visit aptnnews.ca/face-to-face/podcast. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is award-winning filmmaker and professor Tasha Hubbard. And Tasha, I did want to talk about Birth of a Family and your work that you're doing with the university, but we are short on time. So I'm hoping maybe we could ask you if you have any advice. You know, you've made 3 or 4 films now. They've all won awards. What advice do you have for those looking to get into documentary filmmaking or filmmaking?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things I learned very early on was, you know, to really take the time to know your story, know the people in your film, and understand what they really want, you know, what they're wanting to say. And, you know, sometimes I have to start filming because things are happening in the moment. But, I definitely take a lot of time thinking through, how am I going to tell this story? And sometimes even, am I the right person to tell this story? And I think, I think that's an important self-reflection is do you have the experience and connection to the story to tell it and give it what it deserves. And that's what I do talks with young filmmakers, and I try to mentor as much as I can. And the other is to stay really in the moment. And when I started to learn how to make films, there was no cell phones. There were, I think I got my first phone maybe a year in. There wasn't social media. We were barely starting to use email. But what that meant is I learned filmmaking being completely present in the interview, who I'm talking with, in the situation that we're filming. I am 100% present, and I still continue to do that. And in all three of my big films, these are families whose lives are, have been or are being terribly affected, and who are going through the worst time of their life with dignity and with strength. And I go into that, that I need to bring my best to that, to respect that, and so it takes a lot, and it takes time. And when I don't make a lot of films, because I know I take 2 to 3 to 4 years to do it, and that's my process, But there's what's amazing is there's so many more platforms than when I started. There's so many ways of telling a story. It's really exciting, and I just think for every story that I have been able to tell, I know there's so many more like that also deserve that time and that space. And it's been pretty incredible seeing the rise in numbers of Indigenous filmmakers from when I first started to now. And the last time I went to the Imaginative Film Festival was this past fall, and I was sitting with some of my film friends, and we were like, we don't know anybody. We were like, this is so amazing, right? When we first started to go, it was the same filmmakers that would go, and now there's so many, and that's great, and it's great for APTN, it's great for all the different platforms. We have a lot of compelling stories, and it's amazing that our own people are getting to tell them.
Well, great advice, Tasha. I wish we had you for the hour here, but we do certainly appreciate you joining us on the show. Looking forward to what's coming next for you as well.
Great. Thank you.
That is all the time we do have for this week. You can catch up on any episode you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca, and of course all of our shows are available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.